So what I'm going to do, colleagues, and thank you all for coming. Thanks for coming to spend these couple of hours talking about what I think are really crucial issues. What I'd like to do is to run you through my view of what's going on in the sector, what's going on in higher education in the country. It's my take on what I think the critical points of development and engagement are at the moment. I do this talk fairly regularly, and it grows and is modified as is needed. And there are many elements, of course, in this overview which you might think have been overlooked, and I'd be very happy for you, please, to tell me that. As I do this task of looking at the country and what's going on. So I kick off this conversation by saying that we have this basic task of trying to understand what the sociology of higher education is in the country, and it's a really important task for us to undertake, because this terrain, this higher education system that we're dealing with is an extremely complicated one, and there are many ways in which you can come to describe it. The way in which I'm going to describe it is essentially to focus on what's going on inside of institutions, what's going on inside of the universities themselves. And so what I'm going to do is to try and talk to you a little bit about what academics are doing, and also, and this has been a new part of my interest, to try and understand what students are doing too. As you'll hear this is the more underdeveloped part of this presentation, and it's something that I want to improve as I do more of this. But what's the framework in which one needs to be making a presentation such as this? Now, those of you who work in higher education will regularly see people such as ourselves entering the discussion by invoking this white paper 3. This white paper 3 is for all of us who work in the sector a kind of point of departure, because what this white paper 3 does is attempt to create the framework for the post-1994 sector. It's this single attempt, like the South African Schools Act and the South African Higher Education Act, which both of them come in 1996, 1997. It's this attempt to try and talk to this fragmented past which the higher education South African higher education system inherits. And there are many important things about this white paper 3. Not least of all, and it's a pretty unique thing about the system, and I'm not going to talk about it, but it's important to reflect on it. This system, unlike many other systems in the world, introduces this idea of co-governance. It's not very apparent in many other systems elsewhere in the world, but we, the one system here, and it's not worked very well, and it's a subject for another conversation, but it's not worked very well, but we try and bring students very much into our decision-making processes as we are trying to steer a pathway for ourselves. The second important document which we need to be understanding is this National Plan for Higher Education, which effectively comes to create this merged environment in which we find ourselves. So the point to make about this policy framework is that, and it's like that for a lot of South African legislation, it comes with a great deal of promise. it's framed with a great deal of, if you like, commitment rhetorically to really important features of South African society and South Africa's relationship with its past. And in many ways, it's been able to live up to that promise. At least that's what Michael Burrowe thinks. Now, Michael Burrowe is a very important global sociologist who has an interest in South Africa, and he comes here often. On one of his important visits here in 2010, looking at the system and this mandate with which the system has been established, he said that you South Africans need to realize that the one thing which you need to be making a great deal more of is your higher education system. Your higher education system is, and he used these words, he said, is the jewel of Africa. And there really are important things to take away from that kind of praise. But we also have our detractors. In 2008, Helena Sheehan, an Irish academic, came here, and she undertook a tour of the sector, and she went around and visited many of the campuses, and she wrote a really important piece. And in this piece, she says that she couldn't avoid, and I'd like to quote this, a sense of massive disappointment and defeat after having gone through the campuses and meeting people and talking to people and hearing what they were doing. So here you've got Michael Burrowe on the one hand saying that this system is the jewel of Africa. Helena Sheehan comes here and she says, what have you people done? What's happened to this whole post-1994 atmosphere that you had, that you were going to reconceptualize what you were doing and present to the world a system here which is going to be making a contribution on the world scale. So the point to make in juxtaposing these two people is that I think that we're in the midst of still, and I would like to say this, a transition. And this transition, I think, can take us in a whole number of different directions. And you can read it in the way Burrowe reads it, but you can also be clearly seeing how the system has struggled on many fronts. But I'd like to say to you that I think that the potential still is there. And I'd like to make the argument to you that I think that in many kinds of ways, this system is a system which the world should be paying attention to. It should be paying attention to because we have elements within it which, in a whole range of disciplines, from the natural sciences to the social sciences, which have the capacity and the potential to speak to global problems in ways that I think that we personally underestimate. I think we underestimate the capacity of the contribution that we can make to the global discussion. So I want to say to you that there's a distinct sense in those terms that we've got unfinished business in terms of what it is that lies ahead of us. And we've got to be conscious of the fact that we've got unfinished business, because it's important to recognize how the sense that Helena Sheehan talks about can become the dominant thing about what the system is all about. The system can be pulled in directions which actually cause it to implode. And we can see that simply in terms of topography, if you like, of what the system is all about. We effectively have a two-tier, like Mr. Mbeki described the economy as a two-economy country. We effectively are a two-tier higher education system. You've got a layer of universities that are as good as you can find anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, you've got a whole number of universities that are no better than advanced colleges, not even. And the gap between the top and the bottom is utterly problematic. The fact that we are now sitting with at least 5 institutions that are under administration is a reflection of that. Of course, you may have comments to make about how institutions come to be under administration and the whole process leading to that. But it's a reality that a good handful of our institutions have become subject to forces that are I think, too destructive. So, what's the challenge in front of us? I don't want to use this lens to dominate the discussion, but I do think that we're in a state at the moment where we're having to think quite hard about what it is that we want out of this process of transformation. I think we're not clear at all what transformation might mean for us. I think we're essentially now captured by understandings of transformation which limit our capacity to engage with the potential of our institutions. This potential that I spoke to you about earlier, I think, has been constrained by the ways in which we've come to frame what this task of transformation is all about. A central issue, one in which I clearly have had a role to play, a central issue in thinking about transformation are these questions, these legacy questions that come out of particularly this ministerial committee which I participated in, which essentially made the argument that all of our institutions are in trouble in one form or another. It's what that trouble is that I think that we're needing to be a whole lot clearer about. And so I'm wanting to say to you that we cannot look at all of our institutions using the same kinds of brushes. That our institutions all have very different dynamics, and we're needing to understand what those dynamics actually are. And this brings me then to saying that when we think about transformation, there are many issues in front of us that we're needing to be clear about. Is this issue of transformation a question about race? Is it about representativity? Is it about racial access? Is it about racial climate? Or is it about knowledge? Is it about ways of knowing? Is it about how we deal with knowledge and how knowledge comes to be mediated in the societies in which we live? Or is it about something else which I haven't even raised here? And if you have views on that, I'd be very happy to hear what they might be. I have a particular view on where we ought to be going, and I'd like to put that view to you. My approach to thinking about these questions here, about what the way forward for ourselves should be, is essentially derived from this extraordinary intervention that this man Cardinal Newman makes in 1854. Now this man Cardinal Newman got into trouble with the Catholic Church and was asked to leave Oxford in the late 1840s. He goes away, and it's the basis on which he's asked to leave is essentially a doctrinal dispute between the Anglicans and the Catholics. The Anglicans think he's too Catholic in the way in which he manages himself, and so he's sent away. He goes to Rome for a little while and comes back a proper Catholic. When he comes back, he's given this job of establishing the University College of Dublin, which later on becomes the University College of Dublin itself, in 1854. And he writes this extraordinary book called The Idea of the University. It really is an important book. It's a book, however, which comes to be used in all kinds of ways. It's used by a right-wing society in the United States at the moment called the Cardinal Newman Society, and they aren't particularly progressive. But there are things that this man says which I don't think he himself understood the significance of. Because in this book he's asked to describe what his idea of the ideal university is. And I have to say, I've been completely bowled over by elements of what this man talks about. And here's this famous, absolutely famous quote, which I use possibly to exhaustion. And he says, when he thinks about a university, he says that a university should be a place for strangers from all quarters with all kinds of knowledge. You know, he could have been talking to me now in the 2012s. And he goes on to say that it's a place that should be about the enlargement of the mind, and the power of what he's talking about. As I say, I think he himself, because he lived in a very problematic time, the power of what he's talking about, I think, only comes to us now fully, as we now confront a world which is now truly opening up such as never before. We're now getting to the point in our global understanding of who we are as human beings, where we have come to understand, I think, the limits of social difference in ways which was not the case before. And what this man says in 1854 is so relevant now, because he's saying to us effectively, you know, think of a university as a place of strangers. I mean, can you imagine that? It's a place of strangers. It's a place where people come from all quarters, he says, with all kinds of knowledge. Absolutely extraordinary. And so what I do in using Newman is generate two principles out of that in thinking about transformation. Two issues are absolutely consequential in using Newman in thinking about South Africa, thinking about the globe, thinking about universities. And those principles are the principles of social inclusion and what I call epistemological hospitality. Both of them come directly from Newman. And they essentially produce this, what is a kind of personal credo for me in helping myself manage my own relationships with people around me in my own university and with colleagues everywhere when issues arise of exclusion and thinking about defensiveness inside of the university. And I've come to make the point, you know, building from Newman, to say that when I think about the institution in which I am presently and the institutions with which I have a relationship, I need to emphasize that they don't belong to me. I have no proprietorial ownership over the institution. And the institution, by the same token, doesn't belong to anybody else. It needs to be an institution which is always open to anybody from anywhere. Of course, it raises problems. It raises legal problems when you put it in those kinds of terms. Because the legalities of talking about this, particularly in a South African public university context, is around citizenship and the way in which citizenship is determined. And there's a problem there. is a contradiction. But the point is that a university building on these principles of inclusion in epistemological hospitality, which I try to use, an institution has to present itself as being open to people who come from anywhere, who bring with them ideas from anywhere. But there's a caveat, however. Open as the university can be, open as it may be to ideas, it cannot ever be a neutral place. It has to make its objective the search for truth. Now, of course, you get into a philosophical argument here about truth and what truth may be. But the important thing is that one is always on the search for it. And using that as a kind of way of guiding one's behavior and the way in one carries oneself in an institution is absolutely important. The minute you start talking about finished truths, you're in trouble. But the approach, hopefully, in thinking about openness, is that we have truths that are evolving. So, coming then to think about how we might take this discussion forward and using these principles that I put forward here about social inclusion and epistemological hospitality. I'd like to suggest that what we're needing to do in using these principles is to actively be thinking all the time about how we give content to these commitments that we make. How we use these principles of inclusion and epistemology in thinking about how you can make the university work for the public good. How you can get the university to be a place which is above self-interest, how you can get the university to be a place which is above sectional interests and beyond these normal things of race, class, gender and religion. And the challenge is essentially to be how the university comes to create what I call new ecologies, new ecological kinds of environments in which the social and the epistemological are in this interrelationship essentially, and I'd like to draw your attention to that second point here, where this ecology essentially is vigilant always about how you prevent dominant groups from becoming and using the university to reproduce themselves. Whatever the dominant group might be. How you prevent dominant groups from making their whole project, their own social projects, become the epistemological project of what the university is all about. So in that third point, what I'm arguing is how you get a university to be open to constantly disrupting itself. To open to be constantly, in a sense, undermining what it regards as being sacred and as being the key things which come to give it its character, which makes a university an extraordinary institution in the environments in which we find ourselves. It makes the university the one institution that is ready to subvert itself all the time. And how a university comes to be that, I think, is what we constantly need to be struggling for, because no university anywhere in the world is able to do that currently. Dominant groups constantly are able to hold universities hostage in one form or another. But the ideal is what we need to be aiming at all the time. And this raises then just this question which I think is a very pertinent one for us. how do we wish to imagine the university in which we are participants? I mean, how do we come to understand, what the African university should be all about? How do we go about building this African university? I'd like to suggest that we start by doing a quick kind of assessment of where we are right now and what we've got. And I'd like to use the two principles that are used earlier on, the ones of inclusion and hospitality, as lenses for understanding what we've got in the country at the moment. And so what I'm going to do is to give you a very quick run through of what our stats, the available stats we've got in the country, which show you what we've got and how we're doing things. Another caveat here, and it's a problem. We collect stats in the country, and unfortunately only in terms of race. It's not good enough. While representativity in terms of race is clearly important, we need to be also collecting stats in our HEMA systems, in a whole range of other kinds of ways, not least of all socioeconomic status. We don't know who the young people are in our universities except through understanding how many students we have on financial aid. And that's, of course, not an insignificant gloss on what our universities are, but we need to know more deeply who our students are. Now, looking at just at the racial figures, this is what the racial profile of the universities are at the moment. These are participation rates. And of course we have got absolute numbers, but the critical issue here to be conscious of is how low these figures are here of the participation rates of students who are classified as African and students who are classified as coloured. These are the absolute numbers, and you can see these numbers increasing significantly over the last, say, 10 years. Over the last 15 years, the increases in these numbers have been quite significant. So between 2005 and 2010, the numbers of African students jumped from 446,000 to 595,000. But they're not unproblematic figures. What those figures represent, and there the proportions are important to talk about. They represent only 12% of all the eligible young people in that age cohort who could be at university at this particular point in time. If you contrast this to where other education systems are, like the United States, where the participation rate is up to 60%, you can see what these losses in the system are. Much more critical is about how well students do when they come to university. Only 5% of this cohort, only 5% of this 12%, which I talked to you, described to you, actually go on to graduate. The academics in our system are these numbers are much more difficult to change than the student numbers. We have increased the number of African academics in the system, but the professoriate still remains largely white and male. So these are these overall academic staff figures for the country. I'm not going to delay over these. You can just look at these key features of these statistics. Full-time instruction and research staff amongst the cohort in the African component of it is only 25%. Whites still 60%, which isn't much of a shift from where we might have been just a few years ago. How have we responded to what we've got? I write about this a lot, and I need to say to you that there are lots of initiatives in the system underway currently and in the past to change these kinds of stats that we've got, both from our students and our members of staff. Lots of initiatives. Key initiatives are these ones which the minister himself has been responsible for. This is an activist minister. The minister has done a lot in a whole range of areas. Interesting things that he is responsible for is the summit on indigenous languages. You would have received a visit from a ministerial committee very recently. 2 years ago, you would have been involved in looking at financial aid. This minister is also looking at this Charter of the Humanities. He's done a housing review, and he's now, I haven't added this here, he's instituted this oversight committee for transformation. So he's an activist minister. A lot of the stuff, of course, is deeply controversial. It's not without its problems. It's a lot of criticisms he is susceptible to and vulnerable to in one form or another. But he's an activist minister. He's thinking about these issues of this, these questions that we have in front of us. So he's done a lot. But so have other people in the system. We have an anti-racism network, and I should have made this a bullet itself. This anti-racism network is an activist network of colleagues in the system who meet regularly once a year, and they're deeply involved in thinking about how the system should move to change both the profiles of the student participation and the staff participation, and the kinds of activities that are underway in the system. It's a really important network of people. The institutions themselves are responsible for a whole lot of things. Every institution I know in the country, every institution has got a transformation and a strategic plan to deal with this context of which I spoke to you. At HISA also we've just established a HISA transformation task team. So there's a lot going on. The institutions themselves are doing really critical things. And we're really fortunate in many kinds of ways to have the leadership that we've got in the country at the moment. When we were in the middle of the first 10 years of the new century, there was an anxiety about this cohort of new leadership that the system needed. Very critically, I think we can say, and very importantly, a leadership stepped up that has played, I think, a really important role in taking the institutions forward. So there are key leaders at a whole number of higher education institutions, and they've made, I think, a really important contribution to the system itself with the initiatives that they've instituted. We've also got a whole lot of really key initiatives that have come into being at the institutions themselves. I list just some of them here, and I may be overlooking a whole lot. But there are key interventions being made in the institutions, in what the institutions particularly, and now I'm talking about particularly the area of knowledge, in terms of what the institutions are focusing on. The University of the Western Cape is a crucial institution in the country at the moment, particularly in their humanities faculty. There are things going on in that humanities faculty that I think that are way ahead of what many institutions are doing in the country. And it's being stimulated by a group of very young, provocative scholars that I think have a really important global contribution to be making. But there are things happening at many institutions. Very interestingly, a focus of a lot of the interventions that is taking place, of the interventions that are taking place, are dealing with this question of South African identity. There are a couple of interventions that I think you ought to know about if you don't already. One of them is a project at the University of KwaZulu-Natal around racial thinking and changing our identities. Another one is, it used to be at UCT, but it's now at Reitz, and it's essentially about whiteness and how you think about what it means to be white in South Africa. An important project at the Nelson Mandela University is about citizenship and democracy. Reitz has got the Apartheid Archive project, which essentially is trying to understand this legacy of racism in the country, and it's done really key work which I think has opened up questions in all kinds of ways. And the University of the Free State itself has repositioned itself. The University of the Free State has moved from being, I think, a regional university to becoming a global university in its own right, and it's building on the problems which gave rise to the Ministerial committee. It understands itself in strategic ways which I think all of us have a great deal to learn from. And there are projects virtually at every single university in the country that I think we need to be aware of. A key project, and it's important for me coming from the University of Cape Town to be acknowledging these projects, because UCT gets all the press a lot of the time, and it gets projected in ways as if all the initiative is happening at UCT, and there's a lot of initiative at UCT, but it's really important to recognize key things that are happening at the most unexpected kinds of places. And UNISA, of all places, is a leading institution in terms of thinking about the disciplines and where we ought to be going with the disciplines. Catherine Adora Hoppers, known to some of you, is opening up this question of knowledge and knowledge in Africa in ways that I think that are deeply, deeply provocative. There's a lot of work to be done there still, but she's opening up issues of science in important kinds of ways, opening up issues of jurisprudence, opening up issues of cultural studies, which I think come to locate us and help to raise this question of what it means to be a university in Africa in really important kinds of ways. What are we doing on the teaching front? I think you've been absolutely playing a leading role here. Your initiative here around this first year experience is one that many institutions in the country are paying attention to, and it's brought us face to face with this question here, and I'll go back to it. It's brought us face to face with this issue here of having a 5% participation rate in the country and how we engage with this 5% participation rate. The key thing about it is opening up these questions of epistemological access and how we bring students who traditionally are described as underprepared into the institution, and what it is that we're needing to do with students like that. Let me just say here in passing that an issue here that arises, I think we learn a lot from the United States, in particular when it comes to these kinds of questions. A contribution that I think that we need to be making to the United States here is acknowledging here how we also want to tell the students that we're also underprepared for them. That it's not just they who are having to make the adjustments, we're having to make the adjustments too, which is brings me back to this contribution that I think that we can be making on a global scale. important contribution that I think is taking place, and it's a very controversial one here, is around indigenous languages and how we introduce indigenous languages into our universities. UKZN is getting all of the news, but there are many institutions that are doing work around languages and how languages can come to be more acknowledged and made better use of, particularly in the learning process. And an important example, a difficult example, is the University of Limpopo, where ISIPEDI has come to be a kind of experiment which the university is struggling with, but which has, I think, come to teach us quite a lot about how these marginalized languages can be brought a whole lot more deliberately into thinking about teaching and learning. I'd like to come to a close here, just to say to you, just make a few remarks about students. It's really interesting how students are involved in transformation. I think students are playing a role here which is significantly less than what they ought to be doing. Students have not engaged, by and large, in the kinds of politics that we see them engaged with in the country around these questions of transformation. The kinds of politics that students effectively have made the terrain of their campaigns and so on, essentially are the national politics of the country. They haven't made these questions of teaching and learning and what the university's core business is all about the focus of their work. And I've been in a set of real critical discussions with SASCO in particular around all of this, and said to them, and they were really offended, I said to them, you guys have got your eyes on the wrong ball. You need to be understanding what the key issues are that you need to be helping us with, because you're not helping us with these issues at the moment. And so the politicization of the campuses around issues that are not the core business, I think, is a really major problem. I'd like to just close off by talking to you about a couple of real examples which I think are important from our own institution. In my own institution, we've now got something like, and the number's gone up. So our student population, undergrad student population, is in the order of about 18,000. At least 3,000 of our students are engaged in activities where they are using their disciplinary expertise and taking their disciplinary expertise into social contexts through their societies. And it's a really wonderful thing to see. So we've got in one of our societies, the biggest of our societies, Shorco, which is a health and welfare organization, which I, many years ago, would have had nothing to do with. I'm now the chairperson of it. And these young people are raising these really deep questions about what is our learning for, and asking these questions about how their learning is of significance for building relationships with communities. And it's a wonderful thing to see, because it's creating learning amongst our students in ways that are deeply transformative. They come away from these exchanges with a deep sense of what their sociology is all about, what their chemical engineering is all about, what their training as medical doctors is all about. And it's in some ways the most important thing that they experience, while they're at the university. And I say to these SASCO people, look at that. Pay much more attention to how these questions are being engaged by students without this polemical fluff, which is largely, what their rhetoric is all about. Just to draw your attention to a really interesting new student initiative that has come into being. It's called Inkulu Freeate. If you've not heard about it yet, go and Google it. It's a really crucial group of young people. They're elites, of course, but they're elites having to confront their responsibility in our society. And they're asking really hard questions about education and how you put education to better use. So I close off by saying to you that I think we're in these responses that we're making to these big questions that I raised to you earlier. I think that we're making big contributions to the globe, particularly to these discussions of identity. I think, however, that this question of knowledge, particularly this question of our relationship to this hinterland in which we find ourselves, particularly to our African context, is a question that all of our universities are weak about. We're weak. We're weak in terms of trying to bridge this gap between these worlds which our students bring into the university, of which we're almost oblivious and which we're almost disrespectful of. Our students come into the universities with understandings, with a whole kind of cosmology, which I think which we switch off, which we disregard. And so we're making big moves, I think, about understanding ourselves as human beings and getting rid of these racial encumbrances, but we're not engaging with this question of what it means to be a university in Africa in its fullness, particularly in trying to understand what Africa can contribute to our knowledge project. So I think that we've got creative things underway, and we are making major strides in some areas, and teaching our colleagues around the world about what it means to be operating in a university. But we've got problems, and I think the key major step which we're having to undertake here is to acknowledge that we're in this particular place, in this particular time, in a mode of being around which we cannot be neutral. And we cannot be neutral to the fact that we're here in a part of the world which is now regarded as being the most unequal in the world, and which is responsible for many of the issues which the rest of the world is going through, including climate change. And we're needing to think about much more clearly about how we bring, and I want to end on this, colleagues, how we bring the full riches of the knowledges that we have at our disposal and make those knowledges the terrain of work which the university ought to be all about. And it could be an absolutely wonderful thing when we get to that particular stage in our development. We're not there yet. So thanks very much. I'm very happy to engage in a conversation with you.